This is the SRAM Maven Ultimate Expert brake set. SRAM's new flagship mineral oil brake that they claim is their strongest ever. I've had about a week to test these out, and today I want to give you a proper review of the Maven brake set. This is a product that had the potential to be truly outstanding, but due to a single design decision and some questionably misleading marketing, this is a product that almost universally recommend against buying, and one that has the potential to even hold your riding back. To demonstrate this, we're going to run a science experiment directly from SRAM's website. We're going to do an in-depth talk about rider fatigue, and we're going to compare the Maven's results against those of the competition. There's a lot to get into today, so feel free to use the chapters, and let's get into it. I borrowed this Maven brake set from Imbi Bikes, a locally owned bike and service shop here in Metro Vancouver, who also happen to be one of the primary sponsors of this YouTube channel. I have no professional affiliation with SRAM, neither them nor Imbi are compensating me in any way for these brakes or for this review, and Imbi encourages me to review things as honestly and accurately as possible. So everything contained in this video is my opinion, and with that, it's time to get into the backstory. SRAM is a company that needs no introduction. In the past decade, SRAM has released an extensive lineup of brakes that exclusively utilize DOT fluid as their hydraulic fluid of choice, sometimes even directly comparing it to mineral oil in a usually favorable light. The point of bringing this up is not to discuss which option is better or worse, but to provide you with enough backstory to understand why SRAM releasing a premium flagship mineral oil brake sends an inconsistent message at best and is a drastic departure from their previous design philosophy. There is, of course, one exception to everything that I just said, and that is the SRAM DB8 brake. This was SRAM's first mineral oil brake that was quietly launched back in April of 2022 and marketed as a low-maintenance budget option that would require a bleed every few seasons rather than a few times every season. At the time, this made SRAM's stance on DOT fluid being the performance option and mineral oil being the budget option quite clear to the average consumer. Now it's been almost 2 years since their launch, and personally I have seen very few of these DB8 brakes out on the trail, and if you wanted to learn more about them on SRAM's website, you'll have to scroll to the very bottom of their brake page, click on Load More, and then scroll to the very bottom again. So now in comes the SRAM Maven, their new fancy mineral oil brake. They're marketing this as the most powerful brake they've ever made, designed for ++++ extreme duty. Most of the aspirational imagery associated with the Mavens features downhill racers with dual crown downhill bikes, making their intended use very clear to the average consumer. This is a big, stiff, powerful brake designed to handle everything you could possibly throw at it. One of the things they emphasize on their product landing page is that the Mavens give you the power of more endurance and less fatigue. And they have an entire screen dedicated to showing just how much less effort is required to use the Mavens. SRAM mentions that it takes 32% less input force at the lever to generate the same amount of power as their code, reducing fatigue and boosting control. The bold heading of less effort combined with an easy to understand accompanying image make for objectively good marketing material, and a feature of the Mavens that SRAM is particularly proud of. Nothing in this image is technically incorrect, but we're going to come back to this exact image a few times throughout this video, as I find it to be very misleading to the average consumer and not at all representative of real-world ride performance. The Mavens are a 4-piston brake, and they specifically use maximum mineral oil, and for better or worse they have introduced a new brake pad standard. These new Maven brake pads are gigantic, which is generally a good thing, though if you enjoy tinkering or saving money with third-party brake pads, then you'll probably be out of luck in the short term. The Maven comes in at 3 different price points, Bronze, Silver, and Ultimate, with a limited edition Ultimate Expert kit that you see here. The Ultimate Expert kit has been limited to around 2,500 units worldwide, I believe, and retails for the same price as the 2 Ultimate brakes alone, which is approximately 812 Canadian, 553 European, or 600 freedoms. This Ultimate Expert kit comes with 4 different rotors, sets of both organic and metallic brake pads, post-mount spacers, and a complete SRAM mineral oil bleed kit. Other than the red caliper, the brakes themselves are identical to the Ultimates, so the Expert kit is a far better value if you don't mind becoming a rolling red billboard for SRAM. Other technical information is easy to find elsewhere, so I won't be covering it here. Now on to setup. These Mavens were generally quite easy to set up, provided that you stick with other components that are entirely within SRAM's ecosystem. I typically use Shimano XTR rotors for better or worse, and decided to put on a brand new set just for this review. When I installed the front caliper, however, I unfortunately discovered that the Maven brake pads have a protruding appendage that interferes with the spider of these Shimano rotors, preventing their use entirely. I'm sure that SRAM would argue that these tabs are essential for easy removal and installation of the brake pads, but ultimately these brakes would perform no differently with the offending appendage removed, and the lack of compatibility here was disappointing. I'd love to think that this wasn't a bit of malicious design, but evidence has shown that in many ways SRAM is trying to be the Apple of the bike industry. I swapped over to the HS2 rotors included in the Expert kit, using a 200mm rotor up front and a 180mm rotor out back, and this compatibility issue was gone. I think that these HS2 rotors are some of the best looking rotors on the market, and I'm definitely happy to try them out, but I would have rather had my XTR rotors on for testing consistency. The front brake was already the correct length, and the factory bleed was relatively good. They would pump up noticeably but not distractingly when in the stand, and I'm sure this did not affect on-trail performance. Installing the rear brake was slightly trickier since I had to cut the hose to length, but with some careful execution and a whole lot of luck, I was able to reconnect everything without losing much mineral oil in the process, and it even ended up feeling slightly better than the factory bled front, somehow. Installing the rear lever presented its own unique challenge. I much prefer Shimano drivetrains for a number of reasons that I can cover in another video, but mounting a Shimano shifter beside any of the new SRAM stealth levers, which are the ones that point the cable much closer to the handlebar, is a pain. Of course, there is no direct mount adapter available from either Shimano or SRAM, and none is to be expected. I found that in the past I prefer my ring clamp Shimano shifters to be positioned inboard of the SRAM brake clamp levers. Unfortunately, this is no longer possible with the stealth levers, as they sit so close to the handlebar that it is not possible to fit a ring clamp shifter inside that small gap. This is more of a pain than it sounds, because running a shifter far from your preferred position turns it into something that you'll actively think about while riding. Since I had a direct mount shifter installed on this bike already, a ring clamp shifter wouldn't have helped anyways. I mounted up the 𝙎�モ𝑃 EV hardware inside a SRAM brake lever clamp, which is a nice hack, and positioned it outside of the Maven levers. It doesn't help with this painfully outward riding position where the paddles more than occasionally dig into your thumb while riding, but since I'm just borrowing these brakes temporarily, I decided to suck it up and deal with it. I also installed SRAM's metallic brake pads that were included in the Expert kit, despite the organic pads arriving mounted inside the calipers. I run exclusively metallic pads on all of my other brakes, so I figured that this would be the most fair evaluation of the Maven's performance, and to this day, I've still never found a brake that bites too hard that I've felt the need to switch to organic. Now it's time to talk about how the Mavens performed on trail. At first I struggled to bed in these brake pads, something that is not at all uncommon at my 62 kilogram weight. Typically I need to take brakes to a steep trail to actually bed them in, so after a few hundred meters, or about 1,000 freedoms, vertical descending on steep trails, the Mavens finally started to unleash their full power. Let's start with the positives here. I believe that the Mavens are the most powerful brake I've ever tried, and the best brake that SRAM has ever made. I found the bite point to be a bit vague and not super well defined, though some might like this attribute because after the bite point, these brakes are the most on-off feeling brake that I have ever tried. The power in the brake ramps up incredibly quickly with just the small addition of force at the lever side, and generally I enjoy brakes that ramp up quickly, though we'll get to why that isn't the case here in a minute. If you're looking for a softer ramp up in power, then I'm sure that using the organic brake pads on the Maven will perform more like using metallic pads on a Shimano brake, for example. I never felt the need to test the organic pads as I preferred the qualities of the metallic pads, though SRAM recommends starting out with the organics if you're familiar with SRAM's brakes. Throughout my time testing, they remained incredibly consistent, never wandering, fading, or hesitating. You can tell that everything about this brake is built to handle some serious abuse. Thermal management is also very impressive. After bombing down over 250 meters of vertical trail, I threw my gloves off a few times and grabbed the caliper with my bare hands, only to find them slightly above the average room temperature after all that abuse. I genuinely believe that the Mavens are the best SRAM brake to date, and everything I've mentioned so far indicates that they will score very highly in the performance category. But unfortunately, due to a single design decision, I just cannot recommend these brakes to the overwhelming majority of riders. Remember how SRAM promotes these brakes as reducing fatigue twice on their landing page? I could not find this statement to be farther from the truth in almost every situation. It's been probably 4 years since I had to pull off the side of the trail and let my body recover before continuing, and that was on the 1,500 meter Martha Creek descent. With the Mavens, however, having to pull over was almost inevitable after descending around 200 vertical meters on just about any moderately steep trail. These brakes hurt my hands more than any brake I've tried in the past few years, other than codes and guides. I would say that in the current market, Mavens are one of, if not the most fatiguing brakes out there. And the reason for that is that these Mavens have the stiffest levers that I have ever felt. I let probably 10 people test these Mavens on trail and in parking lots while I had them, and everyone had the same two comments. The first was, wow, these are very powerful. And the second is, wow, these levers are very hard to pull. Specifically, the Maven levers are notably stiff throughout their dead stroke, before the brake pads even make contact with the rotor. But how does that make any sense if SRAM's marketing graphic tells me the exact opposite is true? It was time to run a little science experiment to try and make sense of what was going on here. I decided to replicate the exact test depicted on the SRAM website at my house using all three brakes I had easy access to: the Mavens, Shimano MT520s, and Intend Trinities. The setup was simple: rotate the levers into a vertical position and hang a bottle filled with water in 20-gram increments from the finger position on the lever. The grips were removed on the Maven in 520 test to remove friction from the string in the grip as a source of error. When the lever began to move, the weight of the bottle, water, and string was recorded, and the test was repeated 3 times both at and below this weight to ensure repeatability. Now, this test is not perfectly scientific, and I wouldn't compare my values against anyone else's values, but my results were repeatable, and the magnitudes of weights or forces required to actuate the lever can certainly be compared between my tests. Now, let's start with the Shimano MT520, the best budget brake positioned just below Dior at just under half the cost of these Maven Ultimates. To initially move the Shimano lever took 460 grams of force. This is not entirely representative of the force throughout the whole dead stroke, as it feels like they have a little bit of initial stiction, with the force required dropping closer to the brake pads biting. Next, let's take a look at the Intend Trinity. I didn't remove the grip from this one as I didn't want to mess with my personal setup, so the actual force will be a little bit lower with string friction removed. The Intend levers started moving at 120 grams of force. This light action feels incredible, and the amount of force increases linearly through the dead stroke until the pads make contact, approximately equal to Shimano at the moment of contact, though I don't have numbers to prove it. Now let's take a look at the Mavens. The Mavens did not budge at 652 grams, which was the maximum capacity of my testing setup. So after finding a much heavier bottle and increasing the weight once again in 20-gram increments, the Maven levers finally moved at 780 grams of force. This means that the Mavens required 70% more force than the Shimano levers to actuate before the brake pads even made contact with the rotor, and over 6 times the amount of force required to move the Intend Trinities. Unfortunately, I didn't have a set of codes in my house, though I did manage to squeeze 3 different sets of codes on the trail throughout my testing period, and the dead stroke lever force felt very similar to Shimano, always being significantly less than these Mavens. So what's going on? SRAM clearly stated that a lighter input force at the lever is directly correlated to reduced fatigue, a statement that I fully agree with. But they are also showing here that the Mavens are a lighter action than the codes. So what the heck is going on? It's time for a graph. On the x-axis here we have force applied at the lever, or how hard you squeeze, and on the y-axis we have how much force is applied at the caliper, or how much stopping power you have. Without access to a dedicated brake dyno, the only concrete numbers I have are the x-intercepts on this graph. So everything beyond that is an artist's illustration, the artist being me, of how these brakes feel on the trail. None of these are actually linear in real life, but this is a simplified version to show you what's going on. As you can see on this graph, the Mavens have a much stiffer dead stroke and require a larger amount of force to make it to the bite point. This is shown by the Mavens starting off further to the right than the codes. The Mavens are considerably more on-off feeling, where a smaller change in input force leads to a greater change in braking power once the pads are engaged with the rotor. This shows up as a steeper slope on the graph, and above a certain amount of force applied, I have no doubt that the Mavens become more powerful brakes than the code for a given applied force. Based on the way that SRAM has phrased their marketing material, I would bet that the Mavens are 32% more powerful than the codes when you squeeze as hard as you can, which is shown here on my graph, and makes SRAM's marketing claim technically correct, but quite misleading for the majority of riders. I would argue that rider fatigue is directly correlated with the integral of lever force with respect to time as you're riding down the trail. However, that's a bit too complicated to test without some more sophisticated testing equipment. So let's take a different approach. Skilled riders know that the fastest and most efficient way to brake is to brake late and brake hard. The optimal strategy would be to always be at 100% braking power when you need to slow down, or off the brakes entirely. In reality, we all know that this is impossible, but we can assume that the more skilled rider you are, the more time you're going to spend at higher and higher braking powers. The opposite is also true, where an average, advanced, or beginner rider would spend most of their time at lower and lower braking powers. These represent the majority of riders, and they're more likely to drag their brakes or request the lower braking power to keep their speed in check. When we apply this logic to the graph, we will begin to see how a stiff lever plays a very important role on rider fatigue for everyone. Remember that both SRAM and myself agree that a lighter lever force correlates to a reduced rider fatigue, which is shown on this graph as being further to the left. A skilled pro rider is likely to spend more time toward the top half of this graph, and an amateur is more likely to spend most time toward the bottom quarter of this graph, and everyone else is somewhere in between. Now, my hands hurt a bit less with the Mavens than they did in the past with codes, but significantly more than my Shimano or N10 brakes, so I probably average somewhere around 30% braking power, just above the crossover point. The majority of riders will likely fall below this line in the portion of the graph where SRAM brakes tend to be furthest to the right or most fatiguing to use. You might be stronger than I am. It's certainly not unlikely. But if you look at all the brakes on the market, why would you choose to run a more fatiguing setup with all other variables being equal? Depending on what you like about SRAM brakes, I'm sure I can find you a brake that has the feature that you like and a lighter lever feel, leading to less fatigue on the trail and the ability to ride faster for longer. The most disappointing part of this review is realizing that this stiff lever feel was a conscious design choice that was made by SRAM, since they market the Maven as having a signature SRAM lever feel. As I've hopefully shown here, that lever feel is not exactly a positive trait, as it will lead to increased rider fatigue when compared to the competition. If the dead stroke lever force was reduced to be even in line with Shimano offerings, let alone Intend, Trickstuff, Haze, or Hope, then these Mavens would be nearly the perfect brake, and the best option available at this price point. Just about every other quality they have is awesome, and it really is a shame that this one single detail almost negates them all. I genuinely do not understand what the benefit of a heavy and stiff feeling lever is, if there is one at all. Having all of the power at your fingertips is only helpful if you are able to efficiently use it. I'm sure that a very small portion of the community will fully appreciate what these brakes offer. Specifically, that would be heavier, more aggressive riders who have found every other option be lacking in top-end power. Do you need this much power? Almost certainly not. I don't even remember the last time I had to squeeze my brakes as hard as possible. But is it cool to say that you have some of the most powerful brakes around? Absolutely, but not at the expense of potentially holding your riding back because this is just the wrong product for you. Even if you can physically handle the additional fatigue, I would strongly suggest looking elsewhere, and your arms, hands, and fingers will thank you later. Let me know in the comments below which less fatiguing brake you'd like to see on this channel next. And now it's time to take the Mavens off of my bike. But first, we gotta put them through the Dale scale. Starting with the Sendy categories in performance, the SRAM Mavens are an enigma. On one hand, I believe that the Mavens are the best brake that SRAM has ever made, offering an abundance of power that I struggle to imagine would be insufficient for any rider out there. Their consistency is nearly perfect, and they'll probably end up being one of the most reliable brakes ever. They have the most on-off feel of any brake that I've ever tried, which can likely be tuned out by switching to organic pads. Unfortunately, the notably stiff lever seriously detracts from performance by enhancing rider fatigue in a way that I have not experienced on any other brand. If the force required to overcome the dead stroke in this lever was on the lighter end of the spectrum, then I would score these brakes an outstanding 9 out of 10. But since you have to squeeze twice as hard as should really be necessary, we need to dock more than a few points here. SRAM's marketing material talks a big game about how these Mavens reduce rider fatigue. Compared to their code lineup, I have no doubt that this is true under a skilled pilot. But compared to most of the other brands that I've tried, the Mavens ended up being one of the most fatiguing brakes that I have ever ridden. Overall, the Mavens are one step away from brilliance, but that one step is simply a deal breaker for me, and combined with misleading marketing specifically about rider fatigue, statistically, this is not the brake for you, leading to a score of 4 out of 10 for performance. Next up, we have Invisibility, which is a measure of how often you have to think about a component as you're riding down the trail. The best components are the ones that you never have to think about and allow you to fully concentrate on the ride itself. As I mentioned before, the Mavens have been a very consistent brake for me. Apart from the not distracting amount of lever pump, you always know how they are going to react, and they are extremely predictable. If you're riding in shallower terrain that involves infrequent amounts of braking, or you're the type of rider that likes to session steeper trails, giving your body ample amounts of time to recover periodically, then these brakes are practically invisible, which should lead to a perfect score in this category. Unfortunately, on trails that have a sustained steep grade, your body will surely remind you just how stiff these levers are. It's been a while since I've had to pull off to the side of the trail to let my arms and fingers recover, but with the Mavens, this was a predictable occurrence. There's nothing less visible than a product that forces you to take conscious breaks to recover, but ultimately the rating in this category depends on where you live and the type of terrain that you ride. So I'll give these a 4 out of 10 for their below average invisibility. Next up, we have Adjustability. At the ultimate price point, these Mavens offer a toolless reach adjust and an additional contact adjustment dial, which I can confirm does adjust the amount of dead stroke in the lever before the pads initially bite. The lever clamp remains unchanged from the code line, meaning that matchmaker compatibility has been maintained with SRAM's lineup of shifters. For both better and worse, SRAM decided to introduce a new brake pad standard on the Mavens. SRAM offers both organic and metallic options to allow you some amount of adjustment and fine-tuning, though third-party options for further refinement and availability will likely be limited for the first little while. Unfortunately, these new brake pads also have a large protruding appendage which prevents their usage with many Shimano rotors, something that I'd argue didn't need to happen. Of course, there is no direct mount adapter offered for Shimano shifters, but unfortunately the new stealth lever designs keep the lever so close to the handlebar that it's basically impossible or very difficult to mount a Shimano shifter between the bar and the lever body, resulting in a potentially hideous bodge like you've seen in this video. It definitely isn't SRAM's responsibility to design their products with competitor compatibility in mind, but it makes me a disappointed end consumer just how incompatible they are. There are high notes and low notes here, so we're going to average out at an adjustability score of 4 out of 10. Next up we have Versatility, which is a measure of how well these brakes would perform in different categories of mountain biking. A quick look at SRAM's product landing page will paint a very clear picture here, where 2 of the 3 aspirational images feature dual crown downhill bikes and the third one is a slopestyle rider. The rotor sizes provided in this limited Ultimate Expert kit are also quite telling, being 180, 200, 200, and 220, meaning that at a minimum you're expected to run a 200mm front and a 180mm rear rotor with your pad flavor of choice. SRAM has clearly positioned the Maven at the extreme end of the mountain biking spectrum, aimed squarely at the downhill race, shuttling, and park rat demographics. Could you use these brakes on a shorter travel bike or somewhere with less elevation? Absolutely, and they'll still likely perform very well. There is no intended use where these would be dangerous, but if your terrain and riding style are on the less aggressive end of the spectrum, then I'd argue you wouldn't be getting your full money's worth out of these Mavens, and there are better options available at many different price points. SRAM has grown quite the catalog of brakes in the past few years and would likely be the first to echo this statement. Ultimately, these brakes are a specialist tool, designed for a specific purpose with a very clear target customer in mind. You don't need me to tell you whether or not you fall into this category, you're already well aware by this point, but you'll never see these on an XC bike. Overall, these get a 4 out of 10 for their versatility. The score is not a bad thing, it's merely a reflection of their very focused intended use. Next up we have reliability. If there's one thing that SRAM is exceptionally good at, it's making some of the most consistent and reliable brakes on the planet. I haven't spent enough time on the Mavens to assess their long-term reliability, but I have spent enough time on their codes. Almost nothing phases their code line, be it temperature, terrain, altitude, or abuse. They practically always feel and ride identically, which is extremely impressive. Short-term reliability and consistency of these Mavens has been stellar, and SRAM's marketing material suggests that mineral oil makes for an even more consistent and reliable ride. Given their pristine track record since the Guide RS warranty debacle, I have absolutely no reason to believe that the Mavens won't end up being SRAM's, and by extension the industry's most reliable brake ever. It would be dishonest to award a 10 out of 10 in this category only a week after they have been released though, so optimistically I will give them a 9 out of 10 for reliability, with some room for upward or downward movement as they stand the test of time out in the field. Next up is Serviceability, which is a measure of how easy, frequently, and time-consuming it is to perform basic routine maintenance, and how readily available spare parts are if there is a substantial incident that requires them. Routine service represents 60% of this category, and exceptions represent a very generous 40%. Setting up these Mavens was quite easy, apart from my compatibility issues arising from Shimano rotors and Shimano shifters. Although I got lucky, I didn't need to bleed the rear brakes after shortening the hose. The bleeding procedure appears to be very similar to SRAM's dot fluid offerings, just requiring a separate proprietary kit to do so. This Ultimate Expert Limited Deluxe Super Kit comes with all of the tools needed to bleed the brakes at home, which is a huge point for both serviceability and value if you're a home mechanic. SRAM claims that mineral oil brakes require considerably less maintenance than their dot fluid counterparts, which already offer industry-leading consistency and sufficiently long service intervals in my opinion. In true SRAM fashion, these levers are also not side-specific, meaning that they can be swapped left and right for those who like to run their brakes the wrong way, and also meaning that it is easier to keep a spare lever handy or source a replacement after a crash, since you only have to look for one lever rather than a left lever or a right lever specifically. This is much better for the end consumer, and something that I wish more brands did. Being one of the two companies with what is effectively a duopoly in the brake category, sourcing a replacement part should be quite easy whether you are at home or on a riding vacation halfway around the world. Time will tell what kind of volumes these end up selling at, though they'll almost certainly be popular enough that shops will know how to work on them and have the relevant tools and parts on hand most of the time. This is a big deal, as it means that if something does go wrong, there are literally thousands of people around the world that can help get you back up and running. Where the Mavens fall short of perfection is by not offering spare parts available for purchase by the end consumer, and by not being the easiest or least time-consuming brake to bleed. Overall, they get a very strong 8 out of 10 for serviceability, the best score that I've given in this category so far, for a total Sendy score of 33 out of 60. Now it's time to move on to the trendy categories, because ultimately mountain biking is a fashion-based industry. First up, we have the wow factor, and these Maven Ultimate Experts are certainly striking. The red anodizing and oversized design language are quick to catch your eye, as there isn't anything quite like them on the market today. Their appearance alone is enough to call attention to themselves, and it's enough to get people to start asking questions, at which point they will quickly learn that the Mavens are one of the most powerful brakes around. These expert kits have been limited to 2,500 units globally, I believe, which certainly adds to the wow factor. If you're used to SRAM brakes, then hopping on these and giving them the old parking lot test will leave you feeling surprised at just how strong they are. This sharper bite point isn't anything new or frankly exciting to those who are used to Shimano, Intend, Trick Stuff, etc., but it is a novel experience for SRAM users who represent a huge part of the market themselves. Overall, these brakes score well in this category, and they earn an 8 out of 10 for their wow factor. Next up is styling, and let's start on the lever side. The Maven levers look good. The polished lever body and titanium hardware definitely give off the impression of a premium product. Functionality and the risk of ripping out a hose in a crash aside, I quite like the stealth lever design too from an aesthetic standpoint. Everything looks nice and tidy closer to the handlebar, and the cables have a much smaller visual presence when trimmed to the correct length. These levers are definitely an evolution and not a revolution of SRAM's typical design language, which absolutely cannot be said about the calipers. The Maven calipers are extremely distinctive and very representative of their intended use in the downhill space. These calipers are massive, probably the largest that I've ever seen on a mountain bike, and they have a big, burly, and uncompromising demeanor, looking as powerful as SRAM claims they perform. They also happen to be bright red, with a splatter pattern that has the internet hive mind nostalgic over guitar solos from the late 70s, or suggests that they were rattle canned from the drive side of the bike with installed spokes masking the caliper in that pattern. I'm not sure I'm a fan of the visible bolt heads or not against the red anodizing, but I'm sure I'll get used to them over time. Love them or hate them, they're undeniably unique and unmistakable, and it's refreshing to see a big brand, or really any brand, come out with something so aesthetically bold these days. The purple ano craze was before my time, but I'd be stoked if limited edition, well-priced components like these became more commonplace in the future. Big points here for breaking the brake mold and doing something different, earning the Maven Ultimate Experts a 7 out of 10 in styling. Next up, we have the core factor, which is a measure of how cool the community thinks these brakes are. Just about everyone knows who SRAM is by now. Alone, that doesn't make them a cool brand, but I'd argue that they probably reinvest more than any other industry brand into athletes, events, and trail associations around the world. In many ways, SRAM has truly put their money where their mouth is, and while I don't always agree with their business strategies, you can't deny that they've had a positive community impact on an immeasurable number of riders on all disciplines around the world. Combine that with a reputation for a consistent level of quality across much of their product line, and one could argue that they are the most core brand of the entire industry. Apart from the rampant and often well-deserved jokes about SRAM's transition to mineral oil, I see a lot of parallels with the Maven and the DB8, a minimal service required workhorse brake that just works day in and day out. The DB8s were launched very quietly, and continue to be undermarketed in my opinion to this day. Now, whether the Mavens will follow a similar trajectory after their 15 minutes in the spotlight, or whether they'll grow to have a legacy rivaling that of the Code line, we will have to wait and see. When one of the big two players drops a most powerful brake ever though, you'd listen, and that alone is pretty darn cool. This brings the Mavens in at an 8 out of 10 for core factor that will surely go up or down depending on how they succeed in the broader market and the reputation that they develop over the years to come. And finally, we have value. The Mavens are not the brake for me, and I would argue that they are not the brake for most riders out there, but there is a small subset of the community that very much enjoys riding Code brakes. The Mavens are better brakes than Codes in almost every way, offering more power, a more progressive lever kinematic, and likely even better reliability. For those riders, the Mavens are an obvious upgrade, and the limited edition Ultimate Expert kit offers incredible value, giving you hundreds of dollars worth of extra goodies over the equivalently priced and functionally identical Ultimate brakes, at the expense of your bike becoming a rolling red billboard for SRAM. But ultimately, since this brake is not the right product for the majority of riders, and function trumps fashion when it comes to riding enjoyment, these can't be amazing value, and they land right below the middle at a 4 out of 10 for value. This brings their total trendy score up to 27 out of 40. Add it all up and the total is 60 out of 100, which places them here among other components, conveniently brakes, that I've also reviewed. I've also scored the Maven Ultimates here, which come in at a lower score than the Ultimate Expert kit. This is because they cost the same as the Expert kit, but they don't come with any of the additional goodies in that kit. 1 point is docked in the Serviceability category, since they don't come with the proprietary bleed kit, and a few points are docked for their wow factor and styling, since they don't get the bold, flashy red caliper design. Compared to the other brakes that I've reviewed, the Mavens are the most fatiguing option in this chart, and their overall score reflects that. There are certainly a lot of benefits to the Mavens, but that one hurdle is sadly insurmountable for me. Just for kicks, I've added a score here for a theoretical Maven that has a lever feel on par with Shimano, and it quickly climbs to number 2 in these rankings. In my opinion, a missed opportunity. At the end of the day, I really wanted to like these Mavens. Credit where credit is due, SRAM has designed an amazing brake in so many respects here, and if it had just lived up to the marketing hype of reducing rider fatigue, it would truly be one of the best options available today. Unfortunately, it was just a case of too good to be true. I hope these Mavens see a revision in the future, but until then, they are the fatigue world champs, and I have to recommend looking elsewhere.